The events of September 11, 2001, are seared into our collective memory. The images of the Twin Towers collapsing, the Pentagon in flames, and the wreckage in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, remain vivid and deeply disturbing. These horrific acts of terrorism claimed the lives of thousands of innocent people, leaving an unfillable void in the lives of countless families. The world watched in horror, united in grief and outrage. The immediate aftermath of the attacks was a time of profound shock and sorrow. Yet, amidst the grief and anger, questions arose. How could such a tragedy occur? Who was responsible? And how should the United States respond? The search for answers led to a global war on terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, and a fundamental shift in U.S. foreign policy. However, amidst the dominant narratives of grief, anger, and retribution, one voice emerged urging a deeper examination of the events and their underlying causes. Chomsky's central thesis in 9/11, Was There an Alternative?, is that while the horrific acts of 9/11 were undeniably acts of terrorism, understanding their root causes requires a critical examination of U.S. foreign policy. He argues that the United States' actions on the global stage, particularly in the Middle East, have contributed to a climate of resentment and hostility that fuels anti-American sentiment and provides fertile ground for terrorist organizations to flourish. Chomsky does not condone or justify terrorism. He condemns it unequivocally. However, he distinguishes between understanding the motivations and historical context that contribute to terrorism and condoning the acts themselves. He argues that failing to understand the roots of terrorism will inevitably lead to counterproductive policies that exacerbate the problem rather than solve it. According to Chomsky, U.S. foreign policy, often driven by a pursuit of global hegemony and economic interests, has a long history of intervention in the Middle East and other regions. These interventions, often characterized by military force, covert operations, and support for authoritarian regimes, have resulted in widespread suffering, instability, and resentment towards the United States. Chomsky meticulously documents a pattern of U.S. intervention in the Middle East, from the CIA-orchestrated overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 to the support for Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq in the 1980s. He argues that these interventions, often undertaken in the name of containing communism or promoting democracy, have had unintended and often disastrous consequences. The overthrow of Mossadegh, for example, paved the way for the Shah of Iran's repressive regime, which ultimately led to the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini. Similarly, U.S. support for Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War, motivated by a desire to counter Iranian influence, ultimately strengthened a brutal dictator who would later invade Kuwait, prompting the First Gulf War. Chomsky argues that these interventions create a cycle of violence. U.S. actions, often perceived as hostile and self-serving, generate resentment and fuel anti-American sentiment. This, in turn, creates a breeding ground for extremist ideologies and organizations that exploit this anger and frustration to recruit followers and justify violence against the United States. In the aftermath of 9/11, the United States launched two major wars, one in Afghanistan and the other in Iraq. Chomsky argues that these wars, while framed as a response to terrorism, were ultimately about maintaining U.S. geopolitical dominance and control over strategic resources, particularly oil. Chomsky contends that the invasion of Afghanistan, while initially aimed at targeting al-Qaeda training camps and ousting the Taliban regime that harbored them, quickly morphed into a protracted and costly nation-building effort that ultimately failed to achieve its objectives. He argues that the war in Iraq, based on the Bush administration's claims of Saddam Hussein's alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction and ties to al-Qaeda, was even more tenuous and driven by a desire to reshape the Middle East in America's image. These wars, according to Chomsky, have had devastating consequences. They have resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians, displaced millions more, and destabilized entire regions. Moreover, he argues that they have diverted resources from addressing the root causes of terrorism and actually increased anti-American sentiment, creating more potential recruits for terrorist organizations. Section 5. The Preemptive Strike Dilemma. One of the most controversial aspects of the post-September 11th security doctrine adopted by the Bush administration was the concept of preemptive strikes. This doctrine asserted the right of the United States to use military force against perceived threats before they materialized, even if those threats were not imminent. Chomsky argues that the preemptive strike doctrine is a violation of international law and sets a dangerous precedent. He contends that it undermines the very foundations of the international order, based on the principle of national sovereignty and the prohibition of the use of force except in self-defense or with the authorization of the United Nations Security Council. Furthermore, Chomsky argues that the preemptive strike doctrine is not only illegal but also counterproductive. He contends that it creates a climate of fear and mistrust, making it more difficult to address global challenges through diplomacy and cooperation. Moreover, he argues that it increases the likelihood of miscalculation and unintended consequences, potentially leading to more conflict and instability. Section 6. Seeking root causes. In contrast to the militaristic approach favored by the Bush administration and its successors, Chomsky advocates for addressing the root causes of terrorism. He argues that this requires a fundamental shift in U.S. foreign policy, away from interventionism and towards a more just and equitable international order. Chomsky believes that the United States should prioritize diplomacy, dialogue, and international cooperation over military force. He argues that the U.S. should engage with its adversaries, even those it considers hostile, in an effort to understand their grievances and find common ground. He also advocates for addressing the underlying social, economic, and political conditions that contribute to terrorism, such as poverty, inequality, and lack of opportunity. Chomsky's approach emphasizes the importance of justice, fairness, and respect for international law. He argues that the United States should adhere to its own stated values of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in its dealings with other nations. He believes that by promoting these values abroad, the United States can create a more peaceful and just world, reducing the appeal of extremist ideologies and organizations. Section 7. A Call for Dialogue. 9/11. Was there an alternative? Is not merely a critique of U.S. foreign policy, it is a call to action. Chomsky urges readers to question the dominant narratives presented by governments and the media, to think critically about the information they are consuming, and to engage in a meaningful dialogue about the root causes of terrorism and the search for viable alternatives to violence. Chomsky's book is a challenging read. It is provocative, unsettling, and at times deeply disturbing. However, it is also an essential read for anyone seeking to understand the complexities of the post-9/11 world and the ongoing debate about the nature of terrorism, the role of U.S. foreign policy, and the search for a more peaceful and just world. Section 8. Beyond the Headlines. Chomsky's work encourages us to look beyond the headlines and the simplistic narratives often presented by those in power. He challenges us to delve deeper, to question assumptions, and to consider alternative perspectives. In doing so, he empowers us to become more informed and engaged citizens, capable of critically evaluating the world around us and contributing to a more just and peaceful future. 9/11. Was there an alternative? Is a testament to the power of critical thinking, dissent, and the importance of challenging the status quo. It is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope for a better future. But achieving that future requires us to confront uncomfortable truths, engage in difficult conversations, and demand better from our leaders. Section 9. Chomsky's Challenge. Noam Chomsky's 9/11. Was there an alternative? stands as a powerful indictment of U.S. foreign policy and a call for a more just and peaceful world. It is a book that continues to resonate today, challenging us to confront uncomfortable truths, question conventional wisdom, and engage in a meaningful dialogue about the root causes of terrorism and the search for viable alternatives to violence. Chomsky's challenge is not for the faint of heart. It requires courage, intellectual honesty, and a willingness to question deeply held beliefs. However, it is a challenge worth embracing, for it offers the possibility of a more just, peaceful, and sustainable future for all.